So I guess the way to best introduce this is, and as Dr. Sweetser mentioned to us as we were getting ready to speak with you, is the 4-step planning process that we used for this was kind of similar to military planning. So research, planning, implementation, and evaluation. So that's how we approached it. We looked at the 6 goals essentially that you sent to us, and we picked the one to focus on. So we focused on your ultimate goal of a permanent policy which protects transgender service members from to serve in the military. So with that in mind, we had a whole bunch of different steps that we stepped through, right? So we had to identify objectives. How do we think that we can measurably how can we measure the strategies and tactics that we would then develop? What are the publics? Who are the publics that we think can best help you to achieve this goal? What is the messaging that we would recommend that you use when you communicate with these publics? So as you get the book and you start to look through them, you'll see that the book is arranged by those 4 different steps. And so while we're just kind of get to the wave tops of how we approach that, there's much more detail, and hopefully after you take a look at the book, you have more questions and can definitely reach out to us if you have any clarification. So with that, I will turn it over to Mac to kind of set the stage for how we started to do our research.
Hello. So as you know, after the first time we spoke with you, we started examining the issue and doing our background research so we kind of figure out where we were at in the process. And what we found in SPARTA was an organization with a large, diverse membership, but with a small core of active leaders who are actually doing the work, as you well know. But with that small core, you've managed to have a pretty outsized impact on the discourse around transgender military rights. You know, taking the group and through the 2 bands and coming out on the other side stronger. With that said, the ultimate goal is to achieve security and permanent legislation to secure transgender service member rights. And a secondary goal of that is also to build peer networks within that as well. But as we were examining this process, we went to the formative research, as we've learned with Dr. Sweetser. We looked at that and we kind of figured out where the baselines were for you.
Hey, good afternoon, Bree. Colin Kennard here. So we conducted a survey to gain insights into our target publics and guide our plan. So we solicited the survey to military advocacy members, LGBTQIA advocacy members, as well as just folks in the military. We received about 80 responses that we then analyzed. So some of the, quickly looking at demographics, the respondents were about 60-40 military, non-military, and about a 50-50 split advocacy affiliated at any sort of advocacy group and no affiliation. An interesting demographic question we put out was where did our respondents receive their information from? So just generally, whether it was news or if they had a specific LGBT topic that they were information seeking on. Both of those, it was predominantly online searches, social media, and also word of mouth. And so that led to some of our tactic development. Now we utilized 3 scales within the survey, and the first one was a knowledge scale, where we wanted to understand what do our respondents know about rights for trans people, rights for trans military members, and what do they know or how aware are they of SPARTA? Of those, the respondents knew the most about rights for trans people in general, and on a scale of 1 to 5, the average response was just over 3. A little less so for rights for trans military members, just under 3. But when it came to SPARTA, awareness was actually pretty low, and the average response was a 1, or basically, they weren't aware at all for the majority of our respondents. The next thing we did was we went to look at their attitudes. So we provided them a little bit of information about what, who SPARTA is and what they do, and then gauge their perception of that organization. And overwhelmingly, perceptions and attitudes were very positive towards SPARTA. So that was a good sign for us. And then lastly, we tried to determine our respondents' level of involvement when it came to the issue of rights for trans military members. So most of our respondents were categorized as low involvement, in fact, about 80%. But interestingly, when we looked at respondents with some sort of affiliation with an LGBTQIA organization, that number almost flipped. So they were much more likely to be involved in the issue, and especially if they were a military member, where over 3/4 of those respondents were considered highly involved in the issue.
Pedro Caballero here, and to go off of Colin's point about how people receive their information, we decided to look at 100 articles. So that sample size included national news, international news, and industry trade publications. Basically, we thought to look at the conversation in two ways. We thought to look at it just trans rights in general, or transgender service members' rights. And we chose transgender service members' rights because it's we're getting more into the granular aspect of the conversation. And as we coded that information, we noticed that SPARTA took up 24% of the conversation. So of the 100 articles, they were mentioned in 24 of them. And that's 7% more than the next advocacy groups of the 20 advocacy groups that we saw in the entire sample size. So what that told us was SPARTA is the premier transgender service member rights organization in the country. When the conversation was had, if any group was mentioned, SPARTA was mentioned the most. So what that tells us is SPARTA has the corner of the market for this particular aspect of the conversation, but it led us to think and question, how can we lean into some of these other advocacy organizations, and how can we tap into the overall conversation writ large?
So similar to the findings that Colin mentioned, we did some interviews, some in-depth interviews with people who were of the same public, so advocacy groups or military personnel. We found that of the 5 interviews that we conducted, that no one knew of SPARTA, but similarly, when they heard a description about the organization, what it was about and what it could provide, they were pretty positive about it and felt that it would be a good resource for a transgender military person, or for them to be a better ally. So they felt favorably towards that. It seemed as though all of our participants felt that it was confusing, the fact that there was policy change. First it was one way and then another way, and basically felt that it would be important for there to be a solid policy that was inclusive for transgender military service members. It did seem as though people are looking for information, but they just quite frankly don't really know where to go to for information. So, and I know in our previous conversation with you that you've had a lot of unit leaders who contacted you. So it seems as though people are aware that there could be an issue, but aren't quite sure what to do with that and where to go next.
So the entire time we were doing this primary research, we were also reading about theory and how do we change policy? How does that occur? And what we kind of found was that there is a way to examine policy change called the Advocacy Coalition Framework that examines policy changes and looks for ways that organizations work together to further their policy goals. And so that when we found that, that's kind of what we looked at and said, okay, here's a model that could work for SPARTA to build that network. Because SPARTA can be a educational resource for a lot of these organizations, because you do have the specialized knowledge, you do understand the issue better than any other organization, and so that was kind of how we approached our objectives to help you kind of meet those goals.
So to dig into the objectives a little bit, so then we shift over to the planning process, which was the second step. So we set 4 different communication objectives that we think will help you to achieve your goal. So the objectives are they're measurable. It's a percentage you'll see in the book, and it's also a timeline. So we said that we think that if you decide to take on some of these strategies and tactics, and you establish your baseline in 6 months, measure where you are at that point, and then you'll be able to determine whether or not you're moving in the direction that you want to get to. I had mentioned publics, so we also identified three different publics. The primary public to feed into the advocacy coalition framework is the primary public is the other advocacy groups, so other LGBTQIA plus diversity and advocacy groups, because they can do some of the things that you cannot do, that some of the things that some of the service members are constrained to just simply by the fact that you're in uniform, right? So some of the lobbying pieces, that's really why you want to get them on your side, and they probably are, but perhaps, like as Max said, is the showing them the nuances of the issue and helping them to move your goal forward. We developed some themes and messages, as I mentioned earlier, and some of that came from the in-depth interviews which we conducted. So we have a couple of themes and messages, and we think that, you know, if both the SPARTA leadership and also SPARTA members, as they start to communicate either on social media or engagements within their smaller geographical area, speaking with one voice will help to make sure that everyone's moving in that same direction that you're seeking. So implementation. So we came up with 3 different strategies and a number of tactics within those strategies to get at, which is basically the bulk of you know, our recommendations to you based on how we perceive the issue. So the first strategy is about housekeeping. So it's kind of a hodgepodge of a bunch of different things. Some of them are very small. So an example of one of these would be just going through your website and making sure that all the content that's on your website is date stamped. And then also just going through and putting a request to speaker button. So that ties directly into one of our objectives is we think, and we know from talking with you, that you guys are fielding a lot of requests, but by specifically driving people to act, to push that button is going to help you to kind of encourage people to reach out to SPARTA to provide some of that knowledge and those resources. Other examples of the housekeeping are things like, you'll see in the back of the book, is we've provided you with some templates for dealing with the media. We've provided you with some points of contact. We picked three different geographic areas where there's a high density of military population. So you'll see, you know, PAOs, if you seek, you know, want to seek out PAOs. We listed some of the specific news outlets in those areas. So hopefully it makes it a little bit easier for you to start to engage if that's what you choose to do.
So on the strategy of engagement, we broke that down via the macro and then the micro. So for that macro, that's specifically talking about digital engagement. So looking at your social media accounts in particular and talking with Leanne, we know that your staff is small. We know that having social media platforms for an entire organization it's a large undertaking. I mean, we all know how hard and how tedious it can be. So we thought to provide you with some templates to standardize the process. So we included in there a social media calendar, a social media handbook that would give you the ability to say, okay, hey, how are we going to make this easier for ourselves? Plan out ahead of time, brand ourselves, and ensure that we're connected to all those networks within those social media accounts. And then for the micro, that's specifically talking about media. So to Amelia's point, having an idea of some of those larger bases and then even some of those smaller bases around the country where your members are spread out, we included templates in there for themes and messages that your members could understand, some response to query, some templates to send to local news publications with a template for a good news story. And then on top of that, we included a media briefing card that kind of explains, hey, if some of these members who are way out there with no top level cover, it would provide them with a small level of training so that they can go out and spread the message of your organization.
Yeah, and so the first 2 strategies really get after how does SPARTA craft and disseminate its message, and then how does SPARTA use, you know, forms of media to carry that message. The third strategy is build connections, and that really focuses on a grassroots campaign where we can use, you know, other successful advocacy organizations to carry our message for us. So we came up with some good tactics to help get after that. And a lot of it is, you know, leaning on regional chapter leaders, providing them with pre-canned, ready to go briefs and pitches that they can use with other regional advocacy or similar advocacy organizations. And we have a ton more on that in the back of the book.
The final piece was the evaluation piece. And so we set those goals, we set the objectives, and we've made some benchmarks that we think would be an effective use of your time if you were able to reach those. And so we've laid out within the book how you could go about evaluating that, and then also given the products that we made in the baseline surveys and interviews, so you can see how we did it, and then how you could go back and measure at the end. And I do just want to add that we are all extremely thankful for you to give us the opportunity to study this issue and to work to help to hopefully achieve a lasting solution to this issue. We really all just appreciated your time and your team's time throughout the process. With that, that kind of concludes our presentation, but we're happy to take questions and discuss any points you might want to hear about. Thank you.